Andrés Manuel López Obrador started his political career working to empower indigenous groups in his home state of Tabasco. Now, early into his first term as Mexico's president, it appears he's making their issues a national priority. And he's starting with an apology.
Yo, en nombre del Estado mexicano, voy también a pedir perdón por los abusos que se cometieron en estos últimos 200 años, sobre todo por la opresión a las comunidades indígenas.
He's also asking institutions behind Mexico's colonization to apologize, namely the Spanish monarchy and the Catholic Church. López Obrador singled out abuses by Hernán Cortés, who led the overthrow of the Aztec Empire, as well as other conquerors known as conquistadors.
Hubieron matanzas, imposiciones, la llamada conquista se hizo con la espada y con la cruz.
Que haga la corona española este reconocimiento y lo mismo la Iglesia Católica.
López Obrador made his formal request to King Felipe VI of Spain and Pope Francis. The Vatican hasn't issued a response, and as for Spain, so far the Mexican president hasn't gotten the reaction he was looking for.
Jefe del Estado, el rey Felipe VI, no tiene que pedir perdón a ningún país y no va a ocurrir esto, cosa que ha dejado claro el gobierno en el comunicado que desde ayer tienen ustedes del Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores.
In some circles, López Obrador's request has been taken as an insult, particularly among those on the right of the Spanish political spectrum.
O sea, es de una ignorancia absolutamente escandalosa y sobre todo es una auténtica afrenta contra España y contra su historia. Que venga un presidente de México a decir que España hizo toda clase de barbaridades en ese país hermano y amigo es algo que yo no voy a admitir.
López Obrador's request is not without precedence. Last year, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau apologized on behalf of his country for past abuses against Indigenous communities. And French President Emmanuel Macron did the same for widespread torture carried out by the French army in Algeria. Critics of López Obrador's request say it's impractical to ask every country in the world to apologize for every misdeed carried out under its flag. But Mexico's indigenous people trace their current political marginalization back to the first days of colonization. And despite López Obrador's legacy as a champion of indigenous rights, some groups boycotted last year's election because they say they fundamentally don't trust the system. No matter whether Spain's king and the Roman Catholic Pope apologize, López Obrador will have to work hard to give indigenous communities confidence that their government is working for them. Perhaps for the first time since their original dispossession. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to our panel now. In Mexico City, we have Federico Lamont. He's a journalist with El Sol de Mexico newspaper. In Newcastle, in the UK, we have Carlos Conde Solares, a senior lecturer in Hispanic Studies at Northumbria University. And in Washington, D.C. is Evan Maguire. He's an editorial associate at the conservative U.S. magazine, The American Spectator. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Carlos Conde Solares, let's start with you. Should Spain be saying sorry, and should it admit historical responsibility for what happened 500 years ago in what is today Mexico?
Well, in my view, this whole debate has been sparked by very unfortunate populist rhetoric of Mr. López Obrador, in that his efforts would probably be better directed, better addressed at trying to improve the living conditions of the indigenous people in Mexico today, rather than apportioning blame for the extraordinary historical events that took place 500 years ago. And I'm also saying this because it would be in everybody's interest for the Hispanic world, which is the world in which 600 million people speak the Spanish language, to present a fraternal and united front rather than getting distracted with this type of debate that doesn't really take us anywhere. And above all, I would like to say that the historical narrative that Mr. López Obrador is trying to hint at is also a false historical narrative that I'll be happy to elaborate with later on.
So, Federico, when we look at some of the historical narrative, modern Mexico is a mishmash of history with people, modern citizens of Mexico having the blood of the conquerors and the conquered, right? This is more complex than just a simple narrative. Is Carlos right that this is just populist rhetoric from Mexico's leadership to distract from issues at home?
I regret to tell you no, because we can summarize the whole history in a paintist, José Clemente Orozco, who blamed the Spaniards for importing a lot of diseases to Mexican old agents. Mexicans like Aztecs were great, but when the Spaniards arrived to our land, they brought to us diseases. And the most important thing, that mestizaje, that bring the Mexican culture down, and they have been taking our fortune out of the country. They took our most important treasured identity, and that is why some Mexicans are still blaming the Spaniards for that chapter of history.
Federico, yes, there was terrible colonial abuse of indigenous people. The conquistadors did horrific things, right? But is this apology going to make a difference to the lives of indigenous people in Mexico today?
Not at all, because we have 56 different ethnicities in the Mexican Republic, but very deeply inside, they still blame the Spaniards due to what has been happening to Mexico, that we are a third world country, and probably things were different today if we weren't invaded by the Spaniards. That's what most Mexican Indian people think. People from Chiapas, from Tabasco, they are still thinking about that. And they said, why in this world the Spaniards came to our land in 1521?
Okay. Evan, should Spain apologize?
Yes, I would say absolutely not. You can't contextualize an event that occurred 500 years ago in today's lens. The government of Spain today is very different from the government of Spain 500 years ago. 500 years ago, someone from Belgium was actually the king of Spain. He was also the Holy Roman Emperor. So should you be asking Belgium or Germany to apologize? I don't think so. In the same sense, so many different factors play into what's going on in the indigenous communities in Mexico today. And placing that blame on Spain is not good. It's not going to get anything done. There's many other things that can be done to help the indigenous communities in Mexico and throughout Latin America, but placing the blame on Spain for actions that occurred over 500 years ago or around 500 years ago is not going to change anything.
Carlos, why not just apologize, right? We've seen King Felipe say no. The foreign minister called it a weird request from the Mexicans. Why not say, yes, we regret it, it was terrible, and our forefathers did terrible things, and for those who also took Bibles in hand along with the conquistadors, yes, the church is also sorry. Why not just say it? Because then López Obrador has nothing to stand on.
Well, because that would imply validating a historical narrative that, as I mentioned earlier, is simplistic and is false. When Hernán Cortés arrives in Mexico in 1519, the Azteca are not the only people that inhabit those lands. The Azteca were an empire, and the Azteca were a pretty brutal empire at that, to the extent that when the Spaniards arrive in the lands of today's Mexico, they encounter other civilizations like the Tlaxcalteca, like the Totonac, and all of those people very early on become allies of the Spaniards, and they become very, they remain loyal to the Spaniards in their struggle against Moctezuma. To put this into context, in 1487, just a few years before the arrival of Cortés in Mexico, there is a human sacrifice of up to 85,000 people. The Totonac and the Tlaxcalteca will fight alongside the Spaniards against the Azteca. And when I'm asked who that Spain has to apologize, who does Spain have to apologize to? To the Tlaxcalteca, to the Totonac, to the Azteca?
So let's ask Federico
was much more complex than all of that.
So Federico, is it clear to you to whom exactly Spain needs to apologize?
To at least 56 Mexican ethnicities, because they committed mass murder. And talking about what the Aztec did against the Tlaxcaltecas, it was the essence of religion. So that is why I'm inviting your guests to visit Mexico and touch José Clemente Orozco, the most important Mexican painter, who explains in his pictures exactly what did happen. So let us not forget what they did to our great country, and they has to be condemned because, as I told you earlier, they are mass murderers.
Carlos, you're invited to go over and visit. Do you think you're open to a sort of re-education, if you like?
Right. What I think is that the Hispanic people, the Spanish-speaking people, regardless of our race, regardless of our nationality, would be much better served if we abandon all of this rhetoric of apportioning blame for our own history. Because I could also say, for instance, that Mr. Lopez Obrador has two Castilian surnames. Mr. Lopez Obrador is a white man himself, and I think that he's rightly under scrutiny because his government is failing to deliver an improvement to the living conditions of the indigenous people of Chiapas, as Federico was mentioning before, and as many people. So, of course, I'd be more than happy. I mean, I would love to visit Mexico. It is one of the most beautiful countries in the world. But I would like just to note that if anybody has to apologize, perhaps it would be the ancestors of Mr. Lopez Obrador, who is himself of Castilian descent and who is himself living in Mexico. I am not a descendant of any of the 200 people that went on that expedition with Cortés 500 years ago, and I think that we are missing a fine opportunity to really strengthen those historical ties that cross the Atlantic. I mean, I would just like to say that 60% of the people in today's Mexico are of mixed heritage. 30% of the people are of indigenous heritage. To put that into context, only 2% of people in the United States of America are indigenous people. And many of them live in reservations as well. So why aren't people asking the Puritans or the English to apologize to North America? Perhaps because they didn't leave enough people alive to apologize to. And the Spanish government is not going to ask Emmanuel Macron to apologize for the Napoleonic invasion. The Turkish government is not asking us to apologize for the Battle of Lepanto either. And all of this is a rhetoric that, if I may say, is a little bit absurd, really.
So you're saying everybody can shift the goalposts, and then you don't know whose parameters you're basing this on. And just a point to note for all of us is politically this is fascinating within Spain, and we're not quite going to go and look at it. Ahead of an election, we have Podemos, the far left, saying, yes, the Mexicans are right, the government saying, no, they're not. So this could affect those elections coming up. Putting that aside, let me ask you, Evan, Obrador has plans to commemorate the fall of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, or the capital of their empire, along with Mexico's 200 years of independence. That's coming up in 2021. So clearly this isn't going to go away anytime soon. Do you believe, Evan, that he's going to continue to make this a bigger thing, and then something has to give at some point?
I think absolutely he is going to continue this rhetoric of blaming Spain and blaming past historical wrongs for Mexico's current problems, because by doing so, he can avoid blame that would be placed on himself. He can get out of situations by saying that this is a problem that was caused by someone else. This was not caused by me. And he certainly has not caused all of Mexico's problems. Of course he hasn't. There are many factors that have led to that, and he's a new leader in office. But he's going to continue this rhetoric, and he just wants a blame to be placed on Spain, to be placed on the church and other entities, so that problems can be avoided. He's building a So it's the Mayan Railroad in southern Mexico, and many native people have spoken out against this. They believe it's going to hurt their environment, they believe it's going to hurt their economy, and that it's only going to benefit tourists and the rich. So they've actually spoken out against this. And he did a native ceremony to get permission from the earth to go ahead with this railroad. And he did this native ceremony as a way to get natives to accept it, but they did not do that. His rhetoric is not going to be met with action, then people aren't going to accept that.
Federico Lamont, one of the arguments is that Chavez has done this before, Morales has done this before. They just want to blame Spain whenever they need to get out of a pickle. Address that.
But that's a different view. Lopez Obrador got the support from at least 6 million of the Indian Mexicans. There are 12 million Mexican Indians who share the common values, and they all agree, and I'm going to try to summarize in one Tojolabal word or 3 words. It says like, Tac Canticle Quilal, that's a Tojolabal word from Chiapas, which summarizes, we all want peace, but peace can be done without blaming the Spaniards for what they have done to us.
Federico Lamont, Carlos Conde Solares, and Evan Maguire. It's been really good talking to all of you. I thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers.